He had a nickname that sounded holy, but his reputation felt like a curse. Clarence, Preacher Heatley. In Harlem, his name traveled through the streets like a ghost story. Parents whispered it, dealers feared it, and his own people called him the Black Hand of Death. This wasn't your average corner hustler. This was a man who built a street empire on fear, kidnappings, torture, and murder, and somehow managed to turn that into a family business. Today we're diving deep into the rise and fall of Clarence Preacher Heatley and the infamous Preacher Crew, from his broken childhood to how he became a kingpin to the brutal crimes that finally put him away for life. Stick around because this is one of those stories where every time you think it can't get darker, it does. Harlem made him. Early life upbringing. To understand Preacher, you gotta understand where he came from. Clarence Heatley was born around the early 1950s and raised in Harlem, New York. Back then, Harlem was already a place of two worlds. On one side, culture, music, black pride, soul food, community. On the other, poverty, failing schools, and a street economy built on hustle or be hungry. He went to school, but didn't stay long. By the time most kids are still learning multiplication tables, Clarence was already checked out of the system. He dropped out around the 4th grade. Imagine being 9 or 10 years old, and the streets become your classroom. From there, the pattern starts early. He's in trouble with the law as a kid, getting sent off to juvenile facilities. No stable education, no real safety net. The only success stories he sees around him are the dudes on the corner holding money and respect. Now, none of that excuses what he becomes later, but it does explain how a mind like his gets shaped. When the world tells you that you're nothing, and the streets show you that you can be feared instead, a lot of people start choosing fear over respect. And Clarence? He leans into that choice all the way. From petty crime to serious hustler. As a teenager and young man, Clarence is already in the game. Small-time robberies, weapons charges, street beefs. Nothing polished, nothing big yet. Just the kind of constant criminal activity that keeps your name floating around but doesn't make you rich. But here's what starts to separate him from a lot of other guys on the block. He's observant. He watches how people move, how they react to threats, what they're scared of. He's charismatic. People say he could talk like he was delivering a sermon. He knew how to command attention, how to make you feel like what he was saying mattered. That's where the name Preacher comes from. Not because he was saving souls, but because his words could move a room. And when somebody has that kind of mouthpiece in the streets, the ability to inspire loyalty, or fear, or both, they don't stay small time for long. By the early 1980s, New York is getting hit by a tsunami called crack cocaine. Overnight, blocks that used to make hundreds turn into blocks making thousands, then tens of thousands. And Clarence sees something. You can make money selling drugs, but you can make even more controlling the people who sell them. That's when the idea stops being I'm a hustler and becomes I'm gonna build a crew. The birth of the Preacher Crew, a street empire. Around the early to mid-1980s, Clarence Heatley organizes what becomes known as the Preacher Crew. This wasn't a random collection of corner boys. This was closer to a street organization with structure. Here's what they were involved in. Drug trafficking, coke, crack, heroin, PCP, whatever made money. Extortion. If you were hustling on certain blocks, you either paid preacher's tax or you risked your life. Kidnapping, torture. They would snatch people up, dealers, rivals, debtors, and hold them for ransom or information. Murder, not just as reaction but as a tool, a way to send messages. What made them especially dangerous was how organized they were. Inside the crew you had roles, enforcers, the muscle. These were the guys doing the shootings, the beatings, making examples out of people. Janitors, and this is where it gets dark. Their job was to clean up after murders. We're talking moving bodies, disposing of remains, wiping down crime scenes. And then there's the inner circle, the ones closest to Preacher. One of the most important names there is John Cuff, a former housing police officer. Yeah, you heard that right. A cop, involved with one of the most feared crews in Harlem. Cuff becomes kind of a right-hand man to Preacher. That gave the crew inside knowledge on police tactics, a sense of confidence that they could stay a step ahead, and honestly, a psychological edge, because who do you run to when the dudes you're scared of have cops in their pocket? On top of all that, People around them called the organization the family. Because at different points, Preacher's son, daughter, and girlfriend are involved in the lifestyle too. So now you've got a charismatic leader, a feared enforcement squad, dirty connections, and blood ties holding it together. That's not just a crew, that's a street cult. Preacher's mindset. Fear as a business model. Let's talk about how Preacher thought, because his mentality is what made him so dangerous. For him, crime wasn't just about money, it was about control. He understood that if people fear you more than they fear prison, you basically become their law. So he leaned into three main things: violence as a tool. Preacher treated violence like a multi-tool. Someone owes money? Beat them, torture them, or kill them. Now everybody else suddenly remembers to pay on time. A rival dealer doesn't want to pay extortion. Make them disappear. Now every other dealer thinks twice before saying no. Someone inside the crew starts talking too much or disobeying. Handle them brutally. Now everybody else in the crew knows exactly what's waiting if they step out of line. Fear as advertising. In a twisted way, stories of his brutality were like free marketing. The more horrific the rumors, the torture apartments, the kidnappings, the murders, the less he actually had to show up in person. His name alone did a lot of the work. People didn't just fear what he'd do, they feared what he was capable of. Loyalty through terror. And then there's the loyalty piece. Most leaders build loyalty through money, respect, or some kind of love or belief. Preacher built loyalty through a mix of money and terror. If you were in his crew, you might eat good, but you also knew that if you ever crossed him, you could end up in a basement tied to a chair. This is why people compare the Preacher crew to a cult. It wasn't just a gang, it was a complete system: reward, punishment, belief, and myth. The crimes, kidnappings, murders, infamous cases. Now we're getting into the darkest part of the story. Clarence Preacher Heatley would eventually be indicted in connection with multiple murders and tied by authorities to more than a dozen killings linked to his operation. Let's break down the types of crimes first, then talk about some of the most infamous cases. Kidnapping and torture. Kidnapping was a signature move for the Preacher crew. Here's how it typically played out. They target someone, usually a drug dealer, sometimes someone who owed them money or had crossed them. They snatch the person off the street. Could be broad daylight, could be at night. The victim gets taken to an apartment or house used specifically for torture and holding. They call the family, the girlfriend, the crew, and demand ransom or information. If the money or cooperation doesn't come, the person might never be seen again. The fear of being kidnapped and tortured by Preacher's people kept a lot of people in check. Dealers weren't just scared of getting arrested, they were scared of getting grabbed. Internal murders. Preacher wasn't just going after rivals, he was also willing to kill his own. Members suspected of snitching people who disobeyed orders, anyone who became a liability. That's how he maintained control. If your own crew knows you're willing to kill them, they understand you're serious about killing anybody. The Donald Porter case. One of the most shocking crimes connected to Preacher's world is the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Donald Porter. Donnell was the younger brother of Harlem drug dealer Rich Porter, the nephew of a man connected to the Preacher crew. In 1989, on his way to school, Donnell was kidnapped. The kidnappers demanded $500,000 in ransom from Rich Porter. At one point, the kidnappers sent a horrifying message. Donnell's finger was delivered to his family as proof they were serious. Not long after, Donnell was found murdered and dismembered. His death shook Harlem. This wasn't just drug dealers killing drug dealers. This was a child pulled into the hell of the streets because of adult greed and beef. While the exact legal responsibilities are complex and different people were tied to different parts of the crime, the Preacher crew's world, their methods, their mentality, their network, sits in the background of that tragedy. If you've ever heard the story of Rich Porter and his little brother, that's the kind of pain and destruction that this era and these kinds of crews left behind. The Bobby Brown story, alleged. There's another story that floats around interviews and documentaries, a more celebrity-adjacent one. According to some accounts, in the early 90s, singer Bobby Brown allegedly got entangled in a drug debt situation that crossed paths with the Preacher crew. The story goes something like this. Bobby allegedly owes money. Preacher's people, or people connected to his world, allegedly detain or kidnap him. A much larger ransom is demanded, reportedly in the hundreds of thousands. And it's said that Whitney Houston ends up paying a big chunk to make sure Bobby comes home safe. Now, to be clear, some of this is street lore mixed with interviews, not a neat, clean court document. But whether every detail is exact or not, it tells you something. Preacher and his people felt bold enough to touch celebrities, or at least be talked about in that space. Their reputation wasn't just local, it was citywide. Law closing in, the task force. RICO. When you move like that, kidnappings, murders, extortion, drug trafficking, eventually you attract big attention. By the early 90s, the violence connected to the Preacher crew and others like them was too loud to ignore. The NYPD and the FBI join forces and form a task force to target the most violent and organized players in Harlem and the Bronx. They're not just looking for drug busts. They want to take down entire organizations. That's where RICO comes in. RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. In simple terms, it lets prosecutors charge you not just for individual crimes, but for being part of a criminal enterprise that commits those crimes over time. So instead of, you did this one murder, it becomes, you led an organization that committed multiple murders, kidnappings, and drug crimes, and you're responsible for the pattern. That's a much bigger hammer. They start flipping smaller members, gathering wiretaps, building witness testimony, connecting murders, kidnappings, and drug operations back to Preacher and his inner circle. The fall, indictment, plea, and life in prison. By the mid-1990s, the feds are ready. Clarence Preacher Heatley and key members of his crew, including former officer John Cuff, are indicted on federal racketeering charges. We're talking murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and here's the critical part. Because of the number and nature of the murders, Preacher is facing the possibility of the death penalty in federal court. So now the man who built his whole life on making other people fear death is staring at the ultimate punishment himself. Instead of rolling the dice at trial, Clarence Heatley makes a move. He pleads guilty to racketeering and murder conspiracy, tied to multiple murders. Rats. In exchange, the death penalty is taken off the table. But the cost is huge. He gets life in federal prison with no chance of parole. From the outside looking in, it's wild. A man who controlled blocks, who ran a crew that could kidnap and kill, who had a whole neighborhood terrified of his name, ends up in a concrete box, waking up to the same walls every day for the rest of his life. No more corners, no more crew, no more fear to project, just time. Legacy. What Preacher's story really means. So what's the takeaway from the story of Clarence Preacher Heatley? On one level, yeah, it's the story of a kingpin. A man who turned charisma and cruelty into power. But on a deeper level, it's a story about what happens when a community gets abandoned, and the only people who look powerful are the ones willing to destroy it. A kid drops out of school in the 4th grade. He's in juvie before most of us were even allowed to cross the street alone. The system never really pulls him back in. He learns. Fear moves people. Violence opens doors. And if you're ruthless enough, you can make the rules for a while. But the end is always the same. Families shattered, children buried, crew members locked up or dead. And the leader, the one everybody thought had it all, ends up serving life. Just another number in the system. The streets don't retire you. They either bury you or bury you alive in prison. Clarence Preacher Heatley chose fear, and in the end, he got exactly the kind of life that choice leads to.